England, 1813. A duke with everything, title, fortune, a brilliant fiancée, and a diplomatic crisis he cannot solve. 2 foreign delegations at his table, no interpreter, and the most important negotiation of his career dissolving in 3 languages at once. Then a housemaid sets down her wine tray, steps forward and says quietly,
"Sir, I speak 9 languages."
The room goes silent. His fiancée laughs. That particular laugh she reserves for things too small to take seriously. She calls it charming. Like a well-trained parrot, she says. What Lady Cordelia does not yet understand is that the woman she just dismissed spent her childhood in the drawing rooms of Paris, Vienna, Constantinople, and St. Petersburg, and has spent the last 6 months hiding every last trace of it. What happens next will cost the Duke his engagement, his pride, and every comfortable assumption he has ever made about who deserves to be seen. And it will be the best thing that ever happened to him. If you love stories where the quiet ones win, subscribe and leave a comment below. This one is for you. London in the spring of 1813 was a city obsessed with appearances. Every ballroom was a battlefield, every dinner table a political arena, and every unmarried woman a chess piece waiting to be moved across the board by fathers, uncles, and the merciless logic of inheritance law. In such a world, the most dangerous thing a woman could be was conspicuous. And the second most dangerous thing she could be, as Elizabeth Lunn had learned the hard way, was invisible. She had been both, at different points in her life. She remembered the first, the years when she was Miss Elizabeth Lunn of Grosvenor Square, daughter of Sir Edmund Lunn, His Majesty's most distinguished foreign envoy. Those were the years of candle-lit drawing rooms and silk gowns, of being introduced to ambassadors at 12 and discussing trade routes at 14, of moving through Paris, Vienna, Constantinople, St. Petersburg, and Lisbon as though the whole world were simply a series of elegant rooms to pass through. Her father had believed, with the passionate conviction of a man who loved ideas more than money, that language was the only true currency. Libby, he would say, holding up a finger for each idiom, and he had many fingers. A man who speaks one language lives one life. A man who speaks many lives, many. He taught her French before she could read English properly. Italian came next, then German, then Greek, then Latin for the pleasure of it. Russian arrived courtesy of a formidable countess in St. Petersburg, who decided that Libby's ear for accents was, quote, a gift from God that it would be a sin to waste. Arabic and Turkish followed in Constantinople. Absorbed during 3 years of diplomatic postings, overheard conversations, and the particular genius that children have for languages when no one is formally teaching them. By the time Libby was 17, she had 9 languages and a wardrobe full of fine dresses and a future that looked, by all reasonable measures, quite bright. By the time she was 22, she had 9 languages and nothing else. Sir Edmund Lunn had died of a fever in Lisbon, suddenly, without a will properly executed, without debts paid, without a plan. The house in Grosvenor Square went to creditors, the furniture went to creditors, the carriage went to creditors. Libby's dowry, it turned out, had never quite existed in the way her father had described it. What remained was a small trunk of books, a box of her mother's jewellery that she sold piece by piece over the following year, and 9 languages that no one in polite English society particularly wanted to acknowledge that a woman possessed. She tried, at first, to use them properly. She applied to be a translator for a shipping firm. The manager looked at her with an expression that suggested she had said something faintly obscene, and explained that they employed gentlemen for such work. She approached a publisher of foreign texts. He was more polite but no less firm. Surely she had a brother, a cousin, some male relative who could act as the face of the enterprise. She wrote to 2 government offices whose work she knew from her father's years of service. One did not reply. The other replied to say that her qualifications were impressive, but the position was not, regrettably, suitable for a woman. It was Mrs. Partridge who saved her in the end. Mrs. Partridge, who had once been a housekeeper at the Lone home in better days, and who had never forgotten the strange, serious girl who used to sit on the kitchen stairs at 10 years old, reading Voltaire and stealing biscuits. Mrs. Partridge, who had by then become the head housekeeper at Ashmore House, the London and country seat of the Duke of Ashmore, and who sent a short, practical letter to Libby on a Tuesday in February 1813, which said simply, "There is a position here. The work is honest. The pay is fair. Come if you need to." Libby needed to. She arrived at Ashmore House on a Wednesday morning in her plainest dress, her hair pulled back with a severity she had learned to use as armour, and she made a decision before she even crossed the threshold. The 9 languages would go into a box. She would lock the box. She would put the key somewhere she could not easily find it. She would be Elizabeth Lunn, housemaid, and that would be enough. That would have to be enough. She had been there 3 months before she met the Duke properly. Duke Phineas Gage was, in the estimation of London society, the most eligible and the most infuriating man in England. He was 32 years old, possessed of a fortune that made matchmaking mothers weep with longing, and blessed, or perhaps cursed, with the kind of physical appearance that painters tried to capture and usually failed. He was tall, dark-haired, with the sort of strong jaw and serious eyes that suggested either great depth of character or considerable stubbornness. In his case, it was both. He was not unkind. That was important to understand. He was not cruel, not capricious, not the sort of man who enjoyed the suffering of others. He was, in fact, deeply good, in the way that a river is good, constant, purposeful, flowing always in the same direction, wearing down obstacles through sheer persistence rather than malice. His tenants on his 3 country estates loved him. His solicitors respected him. His horse, a grey stallion named Augustus, appeared to be genuinely fond of him, which Mrs. Partridge always said was the only character reference a gentleman truly needed. But Phineas had a flaw, and it was a significant one. He was proud, not vain. He paid little attention to his appearance and actively disliked the social rituals that required him to be admired. He was proud in a deeper, more structural sense. He believed in the rightness of his own judgment. He believed that when he had made a decision, that decision was, by definition, correct, and that revising it amounted to a form of weakness. He believed, in particular, that his engagement to Lady Cordelia Vane was a sensible arrangement that served the interests of both families, and that whatever faint discomfort he occasionally felt in her company was simply the ordinary friction of 2 independent personalities learning to coexist. He told himself this frequently. The frequency with which he had to tell it to himself should perhaps have been a warning. Lady Cordelia Vane was 24 years old, daughter of the Earl of Whitmore, heiress to a fortune built on colonial trade, and possessed of a beauty so precise and deliberate that it felt, in certain lights, like a weapon that had been specifically manufactured for war. She was charming in company and devastating in private. She had a talent for cruelty that was genuinely artistic in its execution. Her insults were never crude, never obvious, always wrapped in the gauze of wit and delivered with a smile so luminous that the victim often did not realize they had been cut until they were already bleeding. She treated servants with the particular contempt of someone who had never, not for a single day in her life, been required to depend on her own resources. Maids were furniture to her, useful, interchangeable, and faintly ridiculous when they forgot their proper function and attempted to have personalities. She had noticed Libby exactly once in 3 months, which was the occasion on which Libby had failed to move out of her path quickly enough in the upstairs corridor. Cordelia had looked at her with the distant curiosity one might apply to an unremarkable piece of decor, and then looked away. Libby had preferred it that way. The evening that changed everything began, as most fateful evenings do, with an administrative failure. It was a Thursday in April, one of those English spring evenings that could not quite decide between cold and merely unpleasant, and Ashmore House was hosting a dinner of considerable political importance. 2 foreign delegations had arrived in London for preliminary trade negotiations. The Russian envoy, Count Alexei Volkonsky, a large and emotionally expressive man who had the energy of a thunderstorm and the subtlety of a dropped anvil, and the Ottoman representative, Senor Ibrahim Hassan, who was philosophical, patient, and had been visibly unimpressed by England since approximately the moment his ship had docked at Dover. The professional interpreter who had been contracted for the evening had taken ill, genuinely ill, with a fever of concerning magnitude, not the diplomatic illness that London professionals occasionally deployed when better engagements presented themselves. The second interpreter, hired as a precaution, had simply not appeared. His rooms were empty. His landlady had not seen him. He had, in the most complete sense, vanished. Phineas discovered this 40 minutes before dinner. His secretary, a nervous young man named Fellows, delivered the news with the expression of someone confessing to a capital crime. Phineas received it with the stillness of a man who was beneath that stillness, doing rapid and unflattering calculations about the evening ahead. The dinner was important. The trade negotiations were important. Count Volkonsky spoke no English and no French. Senor Hassan spoke no English, fluent Arabic and Turkish. The two of them could not communicate with each other or with their English hosts. The dinner was, in every practical sense, a catastrophe waiting to happen in 3 languages simultaneously. "Has anyone in the household any facility with Russian or Turkish?" Phineas asked his secretary, with the forced calm of a man attempting not to shout. "Not to my knowledge, Your Grace," said Fellows, who was already backing toward the door. "Find out. Ask everyone. I want an answer in 10 minutes." No answer came, or rather, the answer came back negative, passed from footman to footman like a terrible rumour. Nobody in Ashmore House spoke Russian. Nobody spoke Turkish. Nobody, it appeared, spoke anything except English and a little schoolroom French that would not survive contact with either delegation. Phineas dressed for dinner with the grim efficiency of a general, preparing for a battle he already suspected he would lose. Libby was carrying a tray of wine glasses through the corridor outside the dining room when she heard it, the first sounds of the evening dissolving into polite chaos. Through the door, she could hear Volkonsky's voice rising in Russian, the edges of his words clipped with offence. She could hear Hassan's quieter, more controlled responses in Turkish, each sentence carrying the weight of a man who had expected this island to be barbaric and was finding himself, regrettably, proved right. She could hear the English voices, Phineas, his secretary, 2 junior diplomats, making the specific sounds of men who understood that something was going wrong and had absolutely no way to stop it. She stood in the corridor for a moment. The tray was heavy. The box where she kept her languages was firmly locked. Mrs. Partridge appeared at her elbow, as she sometimes did, with the timing of a woman who had spent 40 years anticipating problems. "Don't," said Mrs. Partridge, very quietly. "I haven't done anything," said Libby. "You're thinking about doing something. I can tell by the way you're holding your tray." Libby looked down at the tray. She realized, holding it with both hands very tightly. "Oh, it's just, they're making a mess of the greeting entirely," she said. Volkonsky is offended because nobody acknowledged the Tsar's name in the opening address. It's a protocol matter, and Hassan hasn't been offered tea, which in Ottoman custom is a significant slight. "Libby, I know. You know what will happen if you—" "I know, Mrs. Partridge." She walked through the door. She told herself, later, that it was a small thing, a practical necessity, nothing more than the application of a relevant skill to an urgent problem, the way one might use a ladder to reach something on a high shelf. She told herself this quite firmly and with considerable conviction, and managed to believe it for almost 2 full minutes. What she actually did was this. She set the tray on the sideboard with the calm efficiency of a woman who moved through dining rooms for a living, moved to the center of the table with a bottle of wine, and, without looking at anyone in particular, addressed Count Volkonsky in Russian. She said, in his language, with the precise formal register that she had absorbed from 3 years in St. Petersburg, that the Duke of Ashmore wished to express his profound respect for the Tsar and his emissary, and that the absence of a formal interpreter was a matter of deep regret, that in no way reflected the importance with which His Grace regarded this meeting. Volkonsky's monologue stopped as though she had turned a switch. He stared at her. She poured wine. Then she turned slightly and addressed Hassan in Turkish, not the careful, self-conscious Turkish of someone who had studied it in a classroom, but the easy, idiomatic Turkish of someone who had lived it, who had bargained in its markets and listened to its poetry, read aloud in candlelit rooms. She told him that the Duke sent his greetings and trusted that the journey had been comfortable, and that tea would be brought immediately. Hassan set down his fork. Very slowly, he looked at her with the particular attention of a man encountering something that has rearranged his expectations of the room. "You speak Turkish," he said, in Turkish, as though testing the words. "Among other languages," she replied, in the same. "How many others?" "Enough for this evening." The dining room was very quiet. Phineas was looking at her from the head of the table with an expression she could not quite read. Not surprise, exactly, because surprise implies a simple recalibration of expectation, and what was on his face was more complicated than that. He was looking at her the way one looks at a map that has suddenly revealed a country you didn't know existed. Lady Cordelia, seated to his right, broke the silence with a laugh, the particular laugh she used for things she wished to reduce in size. "How charming," she said, with a smile that could have cut glass. "A maid who speaks Russian, like a very well-trained parrot." The room waited. Libby did not reply. She had learned, over several years of practicing invisibility, that the most effective response to that sort of remark was no response at all. That silence, properly deployed, could be more devastating than any comeback. She simply moved to refill the next glass, with the serenity of someone who had not heard anything of particular interest. It was Hassan who spoke. He said, in English, his first English words of the evening, delivered with the deliberate precision of someone choosing a weapon, that in his experience, a person who could speak many languages had, by definition, lived many lives. He said that in his country, such a person would be received with great honor. He looked briefly at Cordelia. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Cordelia's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes did. Phineas was still watching Libby. She could feel it. She finished the table and left the room. She expected nothing to come of it. That was not false modesty. It was a pragmatic assessment, based on 3 months of observation. Phineas was a practical man. He would note what had happened, file it appropriately in the ledger of his mind, and move on. The box would stay locked. Libby would go back to being invisible, which was exactly what she preferred. She had not accounted for the fact that Phineas was also, underneath the practicality and the pride, a man who was constitutionally incapable of leaving an interesting question unanswered. She found him in the library at 11 o'clock that night, when she went in to collect the abandoned glasses from the post-dinner reading that senior members of the household sometimes indulged in. He was in the leather armchair by the fire, jacket discarded, cravat loosened, reading Voltaire in the original French, not performing the reading of Voltaire, actually reading it, with a pencil making small notes in the margins, which was the sort of thing that, Libby thought despite herself, revealed a great deal about a person. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. "You don't have to go," he said. It was not a command. It was a statement, offered in a tone so matter-of-fact that it caught her off guard. She took 2 steps into the room and began collecting glasses. "Where did you learn Russian?" he asked, turning a page. "St. Petersburg, Your Grace." "And Turkish?" "Constantinople." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the fire and the distant sounds of the house settling into night. "How many languages do you speak?" She considered lying. The lie was easy. She had practiced it. Something about a little French, some Italian picked up from a cook. But there was something about the library, about the Voltaire with pencil marks in the margins, about the way he had asked the question as though he actually wanted to know and not merely to be surprised by an amusing anecdote. 9, she said. He lowered the book, not dramatically. He set it on his knee and looked at her with the focused attention of a man doing arithmetic. 9, he repeated, counting Latin, which is technically deceased. If that disqualifies it, then 8. Latin doesn't disqualify. A pause. Why didn't you say so when you were hired? And there it was, the question she had been waiting for, the one with the real answer underneath it. She placed the last glass on the tray and looked at him directly, which was perhaps more directness than was strictly appropriate for a housemaid addressing a duke in his private library at midnight. But the hour and the fire and the penciled Voltaire had rearranged the usual rules slightly. Because maids with 9 languages are not hired as translators, she said. They are hired as curiosities, shown off at dinner parties, made to perform for guests, and then dismissed when the novelty becomes inconvenient or the guests begin to ask uncomfortable questions about why a person of such education is carrying their coats. He was very still. She had the sense of having said something that landed differently than she'd intended, not badly, but more precisely, the way an arrow lands differently when the target is closer than you estimated. That is, he began. True, she said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, the way things shift in novels, but the small, almost imperceptible shift of a man who has been told something he cannot argue with and is deciding what to do with that information. I was going to say unjust, he said. She had not expected that. Oh, she said. And then, because there was nothing more useful to say, good night, Your Grace. She left with her tray. He watched her go. In the corridor outside, she stopped for just a moment, her back against the wall, the tray cool in her hands, and she stood there in the quiet dark and told herself, clearly, firmly, with all the authority of someone who had survived considerable adversity through the reliable application of common sense. that whatever had just happened in that library was not interesting, was not significant, was not something she was going to think about. She thought about it for the next 6 days. The negotiations did not, as Phineas had feared, collapse in the aftermath of the interpreter disaster. They were salvaged, almost entirely, by Libby. This was not Phineas's idea, or rather, it was his idea, but it arrived somewhat sideways, via the mechanism of practical necessity rather than the more direct route of personal inclination, which he would have found more difficult to justify to himself. Fellows brought him the situation on Friday morning. Volkonsky had agreed to continue the talks, but only on the condition that the translator from Thursday evening be present at all subsequent sessions. He had made this demand in Russian, which Fellows reported second-hand via a series of embarrassed gestures from someone who had been in the room at the time. Hassan had added his endorsement with the particular serenity of someone who has already won and is simply waiting for the other party to realize it. "They want the maid," Fellows said, in the tone of a man who found the sentence surreal. "Her name is Miss Lunn," Phineas said. "Yes, Your Grace. Arrange it." He told himself it was purely practical. He told himself this quite a lot over the following days. The sessions were held in the library, which Phineas had chosen because it was the most neutral room in the house, free of the social theatre of the drawing room and the formality of the study. He had not chosen it. He was clear about this, because he had recently had an interesting conversation there with a woman who read Voltaire. The first session lasted 4 hours. Libby translated without notes, moving between Russian and Turkish and English with the ease of someone changing registers in a single conversation, occasionally pausing to explain a cultural nuance that went beyond the words themselves. The specific gravity a Russian word carried in the context of imperial honor. The way a Turkish construction could imply a commitment that its English equivalent left open. Volkonsky was transported. He addressed her after an hour with the respectful formality he reserved for people he had decided were worthy of him, which, Phineas gathered, was not a category he populated easily. Hassan smiled, a small, private smile that appeared briefly and was gone, but which felt, to those who noticed it, like a form of blessing. Phineas sat at the head of the table and conducted the negotiations, and told himself he was not watching her. He was watching her. He was watching the way she listened, completely, without the half attention that most people applied to conversations, the way she seemed to process not just the words, but the architecture of each sentence, the weight of what was said and what was carefully not said. He was watching the small, precise gestures she used when searching for the right word in one language to carry the full meaning of something said in another. He was watching the way she handled Volkonsky's theatrical explosions of indignation, not with alarm, not with deference, but with a kind of calm attention that seemed to say, "I see what you are doing, and it is somewhat effective, and I will translate it faithfully. But you should know I am not fooled." On the second day, during a break in the negotiations, he brought her tea without quite deciding to. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. He looked at a point approximately 6 inches above her left shoulder. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "How do you say 'thank you' in 9 languages?" he asked, which had not been what he intended to say, and he was not certain why he had said it. She told him. She went through each one. The French merci with its quick informality, the Russian spasibo with its particular warmth, the Arabic shukran, the Turkish teşekkür ederim, the Latin gratis agere, and he listened with an attention that was not, he recognized distantly, entirely linguistic. "My Latin is extremely poor," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard you reading Cicero aloud last Tuesday. You mispronounced consul 3 times. You were outside the library on Tuesday. I was cleaning the corridor, Your Grace. Sound travels. Did you consider correcting me? I considered it, and decided against. You seemed very committed to your pronunciation. He looked at her. She was looking at the tea. Something at the corner of her mouth was doing something that was not quite a smile, and was not quite not a smile. He went back to the negotiations. Lady Cordelia was not oblivious. Whatever else she was, and she was many things, not all of them comfortable, she was not a fool. She had been watching the library sessions from the periphery, catching fragments through half-open doors, reading the temperature of rooms she entered after Libby had left them. She had noticed the way Phineas moved through the house differently now, with a faint, uncharacteristic restlessness, the way a room acquires a different quality of air when something new has been introduced into it. She had also noticed that he laughed, occasionally, in the library. She had not heard him laugh since before the engagement was announced. Lady Cordelia did not like this, but more than not liking it, she was constitutionally unable to let a challenge stand, without responding to it in the most spectacular way available. She was, in this sense, an artist, and her medium was public humiliation, executed with the exquisite timing of a woman who had been practicing since childhood. She organized a soiree. She framed it as a celebration of the successful negotiations, a gathering of the season's finest minds and most elegant personages, a cultural event befitting the Ashmore name. She invited 60 people. She arranged the music personally. She oversaw the floral decorations with the focused attention of a general deploying cavalry. And in the centre of it all, she prepared a small, perfect, devastating trap. The evening began beautifully. The rooms of Ashmore House blazed with candlelight. The music was Haydn, performed by a quartet Cordelia had hired specifically because they were excellent and because excellence made her look generous. The guests were splendid. The champagne was cold. Libby moved through the edges of all of it, serving, collecting, the practiced invisibility she had been maintaining for months. She noticed nothing unusual until Cordelia's voice, carrying the particular projection of someone who has been educated to be heard, rose above the general conversation and addressed the room. "Friends," said Cordelia, with a radiance that lit the room like a second set of candles. "We have been so fortunate this season to have in Ashmore House what I can only describe as a singular curiosity. A maid who speaks, if the reports are to be believed, 9 languages. Libby, darling, do come forward." The room turned. 60 faces, many of them recognizing something theatrical in the moment, arranged themselves toward her with the collective attention of an audience that has heard the curtain about to go up. Libby came forward. There was nothing else to do. "Do give us a demonstration," said Cordelia warmly, as though she were doing Libby an enormous favour. "Something in each language, perhaps. Just a phrase or two. After all, it is such an entertaining accomplishment." She said the word entertaining, the way one might say impossible to take seriously. She said accomplishment, the way one might say trick. The room waited. Volkonsky and Hassan, who had been invited as guests of honour and were standing near the window, waited with a different quality of attention. Alert, assessing. Libby stood in the centre of the room. The box where she kept her languages was, as always, locked. But she had the key. She looked at Cordelia, a long, clear look, the kind that does not flinch and does not perform, and does not ask for anything. Then she spoke. She spoke in Italian first, not a casual phrase, but a sentence from Machiavelli, something she had read at 15 in her father's library in Vienna. something that had settled into her memory with the permanence of things that are true. She said, "Those who laugh at others rarely ask themselves what others laugh at in return." She moved without pause into French, a line from Montesquieu, considered and deliberate. She said, "Ignorance is the only obstacle between an ordinary person and greatness." She continued, German, a precise observation from Goethe about the nature of character. Russian, something from Pushkin that landed in the room with the particular weight of a language that did not apologize for its own depth. Arabic, a classical proverb about the uses of silence. Turkish, a line she had heard a scholar recite in Constantinople about the distance between what is said and what is meant. And then she stopped, and in English, her first language, the language she had grown up speaking and reading and thinking in, the language she had been speaking all her life in rooms where nobody had paid much attention to what she was saying. In English, looking directly at Cordelia with a politeness so perfect it had edges, she said, "Those were from Machiavelli, Montesquieu, Goethe, Pushkin, and 2 classical scholars, whose names I would be happy to provide in writing. My father taught me that languages are not tricks. They are lives. Each one I learned is a life I have lived. In rooms, in markets, in libraries, in conversations with people who trusted that the girl listening understood them. I am not a curiosity, Lady Cordelia. I am simply a person who listened more carefully than most." The room was silent. Then Volkonsky, from his position near the window, began to clap. He clapped slowly, deliberately, in the Russian manner, the kind of applause that carries intention. Hassan smiled, the real smile this time, not the small private one. A few other guests joined, the hesitant applause of people who were not sure of the social calculus, but were fairly sure they had just witnessed something important. Cordelia's smile remained perfectly in place. Her eyes were doing something entirely different from her mouth. Phineas was standing near the fireplace. He had not moved. He was looking at Libby with the expression of a man who has been presented with evidence that contradicts a theory he has held for a long time and is in the process of updating it completely. She went outside afterward, when the guests were occupied and the applause had dissolved back into conversation, and no one was particularly watching where the serving staff went. The garden at Ashmore House was private and poorly lit and cold at this hour, and those were all, at this moment, recommendations. She stood near the rose beds that were not yet in flower. It was too early for roses. Everything was still tight and dormant and waiting. And she breathed the cold air and told herself that she had done something imprudent and that she needed to decide how to manage the consequences. She heard footsteps on the gravel. She did not need to turn to know who they belonged to. "That was," said Phineas from behind her, "extraordinarily unwise." "Yes," she agreed, "and completely correct." She turned then. He was standing a few feet away, jacket dark against the darker garden, his breath a small cloud in the cold air. "You don't have to. I should have said something," he said. "At the dinner. In the corridor after. At any point in the last 3 weeks when she was unkind, and I said nothing because it was convenient not to." He said this with the specific discomfort of a person making a confession they have been avoiding. "I am aware that my silence was a form of permission." She looked at him. There was something in his voice that she hadn't heard before. Not softness, exactly. Because softness was not his register, but something adjacent to it, something that required effort to produce and was therefore, she thought, more honest than any easy kindness would have been. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The garden was quiet. In the house behind them, someone had sat down at the piano and was playing something slow and searching. Because, he said, and then stopped, and then began again. Because you are the only person in that house who tells me the truth without wanting anything in return. My solicitors tell me what they think will please me. My secretary tells me what he thinks I need to hear. My fiancé, he paused briefly on the word, tells me things that are strategic. You tell me when I mispronounce Latin. That's a very low bar for honesty, she said. It's higher than you might think. The piano continued. She looked at the rose beds, dormant, tightly closed, waiting for something. This is going to complicate things, she said. It's already complicated, he said. More complicated. Probably. A pause. I find I mind less than I should. She should have said something practical then. She should have said, Your Grace, I am your housemaid, and you are a duke, and Lady Cordelia's family has the kind of influence that ends careers and closes doors. And the fact that you can hold an interesting conversation in a library and think that injustice is worth mentioning does not change the architecture of the world we are standing in. She should have said that. Instead, she said, The roses will be out in 3 weeks. It was not an answer to anything, but he looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression loosened slightly, the way a fist opens, gradually, when the thing that was being gripped is released. I know, he said. I'll be in the country by then. Yes, she said. Good night, Your Grace. She went inside. He stayed in the garden for a while, which she knew because she could see the dark shape of him from the kitchen window, standing quite still among the not yet roses. The letter arrived on a Monday. Libby was in the upstairs corridor when Mrs. Partridge found her, and she knew from the way the older woman was walking, brisk, purposeful, with none of her usual commentary on the state of the floorboards, that something had shifted. The Earl of Whitmore has written to His Grace, said Mrs. Partridge, which was all she said. But she was watching Libby's face when she said it, and Libby understood the rest. She understood it, and she accepted it with the competence that adversity had given her. She went downstairs and began organizing her small collection of books and the single photograph of her father that she kept on the windowsill of her room. And she told herself, clearly, practically, that this had always been the probable outcome, that she had always known this, that the appropriate response to the probable outcome was the same as it always was. Pack the trunk, find the next position, carry the languages and the memory of 9 months in a good house where the housekeeper had been kind, and the library had been beautiful, and the Duke had once brought her tea without deciding to. She was folding her second dress when Phineas knocked on the door. She had never seen him on this floor of the house. It was not precisely a violation of anything. It was his house, after all, every floor of it. But there was something dislocating about it, the way a familiar word becomes strange when you hear it in an unexpected context. "You're packing," he said, looking at the trunk. "You received a letter," she said. "I received a letter." He stepped inside, which was also something that had not happened before. "Aha, the Earl of Whitmore is of the opinion that your continued presence in this household is an insult to the Vane family, and suggests that your removal would constitute a necessary gesture of good faith toward the marriage." "I see," she said. "I'll be out by Thursday." "You won't," he said. She stopped folding. "Your Grace." "I replied to the Earl this morning," he said. He said it in the tone he used for statements of fact. Not apology, not drama, just the flat delivery of something that had been decided. "I told him that Miss Elizabeth Lunn is an indispensable member of this household, that her service has been exceptional, and that suggestions regarding the management of my staff fall outside his jurisdiction. Libby put down the dress very carefully. "That will cost you," she said. Perhaps he'll threaten the engagement." He might. Phineas looked at the photograph of her father on the windowsill. "Your father?" "Yes. He looks like a man who enjoyed a conversation." "He did," she said, and something moved in her chest, the particular ache of the present tense that has had to become past tense. "He would have liked you, I think." "You argue with books." "Is that a recommendation?" "It's the highest one I know." He looked at her then, the full, direct look that she had been carefully not receiving for 3 weeks because she had understood, in the practical part of her mind, where it led. The direct look of a man who has made a decision, and unlike his previous decisions, is uncertain of it, and finds that uncertainty tolerable because the alternative is worse. "There are things," he said, "that cost less than other things. Some things that appear to cost a great deal cost, on closer examination, very little. And other things that appear to be free are, in fact, upon examination, the most expensive decisions a person can make." "You're talking about the engagement," she said. "I'm talking about several things simultaneously," he said. I am not, as you have probably noticed, extremely practiced at talking about several things simultaneously." "You're better at it than you think," she said. "You're just afraid of where the sentences end." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to need those languages," he said, "for the final signing next week." "I know. Don't pack the trunk." She didn't answer. He left. She stood in the middle of her room with the folded dress in her hands and looked at the not-packed trunk and the photograph of her father and the window where the afternoon light was doing something particularly golden and unreasonable. And she sat down on the edge of the bed and breathed. The day of the final signing was one of those English spring mornings that make up for all the grey ones, clear and bright and generous with light, the kind of morning that makes even Londoners briefly sympathetic to the sun. The great hall of Ashmore House had been arranged with formal precision, 2 long tables, the British documentation in neat stacks, the delegations in their finest. Libby arrived early, as she always did, and arranged herself near the window where the light was good and she could see all 3 groups simultaneously. She had dressed more carefully than usual, not elaborately, but carefully, which is different. Mrs. Partridge had left a small gold pin on her windowsill that morning without comment. The delegations arrived. Volkonsky, resplendent and emotional. Hassan, composed and watchful. The English contingent, solemn in the way of men who understood they were participating in history and were slightly self-conscious about it. Cordelia arrived last. She was, as always, devastating to look at. Her dress was the exact colour of confidence. She took her place near Phineas with the proprietary ease of a woman who considers the space around a man to be an extension of her territory. And she stood there in the good morning light, and she smiled at the room. Libby began the translations. The final review of the document was the last formal hurdle, a reading of each clause, rendered into all 3 languages, confirmed by all 3 parties. It was intricate work, the kind that required the full architecture of her attention, and she gave it that. And for a while there was nothing in the room except the work itself and the satisfaction of doing it well. She was in the middle of the 4th clause, a delicate point about commercial precedents that Hassan had flagged as requiring precise language, when she heard Cordelia's voice, low and intended only for Phineas, from 3 feet away. "My father's patience has limits," said Cordelia, with the pleasantness of a woman describing the weather. "Dismiss her this week, or the engagement is finished. Consider carefully, Phineas. A maid or a county? Libby did not look up. She continued translating. She rendered the fourth clause into Turkish, paused for Hassan's confirmation, turned to render it in Russian. In her peripheral vision, she could see Phineas. He was very still. She rendered the fourth clause into Russian. Volkonsky nodded. She turned to the fifth. Then Phineas spoke. "Very well," he said. "I beg your pardon," said Cordelia. "The engagement. Very well. If those are the terms, then it is finished." The pause that followed was significant. Cordelia turned to look at him with the expression of a woman who has said something that always worked before and is encountering for the first time the possibility that it has not worked. "You cannot be serious." "I am," he said, "almost always serious. It is, as you have frequently pointed out, one of my less endearing qualities." Libby had stopped translating. The room had noticed. Volkonsky and Hassan were watching with the specific interest of people who understand that something more important than a trade agreement is being negotiated. "Po, you are choosing a servant," said Cordelia, her voice carrying the particular edge of someone who is trying to reduce the scale of something by naming it incorrectly, "over everything." "I am choosing," said Phineas, with the methodical clarity of a man who has thought this through and dislikes the fact that he didn't think it through sooner. To stop making decisions based on what is convenient rather than what is right. They are, I have discovered, not usually the same thing. He looked then at Libby. She had not moved. She was holding the document in both hands and looking at him with an expression that she was, for once, not able to make unreadable, because the expression was too many things at once: surprise and relief, and something more complicated that she had been keeping in the locked box along with the languages. Cordelia looked at her too, and then, with a magnificence that was almost admirable, she gathered herself, straightened her spine, lifted her chin, arranged her face into its most perfect expression, and she walked out of the room. Slowly, with the grace of a woman who intends the exit to be the last word. The door closed. The room released a breath. Volkonsky said something in Russian. It was, Libby registered distantly, a blessing, a traditional Russian blessing for a man who has finally come to his senses. She did not translate it aloud. Afterward, when the document was signed and the delegations were celebrating and the champagne had appeared from somewhere, she found a quiet corner near the library door and stood there for a moment, just breathing. She heard his footsteps. She had become, over the last 3 weeks, extremely familiar with his footsteps. "The fifth clause," she said, when he stopped beside her. "Hassan still has a concern about the phrasing of the obligation clause. You should—" "Libby." She stopped. He used her first name rarely, and each time it had the effect of rearranging the room slightly. I'm going to say something," he said, "that I have been constructing for some time, and have consequently over-prepared, and it will probably come out badly. And I would ask you to extend me the same patience you extended to Volkonsky during the second session when he went on for 40 minutes about the historical injustices of the 1809 treaty. That's a very high standard," she said. "Volkonsky is extremely loud." "I'm aware. Nevertheless." She turned to face him. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, uncertain. Not anxious. Uncertainty in him was too substantial for anxiety. It was more like the discomfort of a very solid structure encountering something it was not designed for and adapting anyway. "I have spent," he said, 32 years being quite certain that the primary obstacle between myself and the right decision was other people's unreasonableness. I have recently, through a series of events involving 2 foreign delegations, a number of languages I don't speak, and someone who corrects my Latin without being asked, revised this assessment significantly. How significantly? She asked. In the direction of it being primarily my own obstinacy, he said, my own pride, my willingness to accept arrangements that were convenient rather than ones that were honest, and to call that willingness duty in order to make it sound better than it was. She was very still. The light from the library behind them was doing something warm and golden. In the distance, she could hear Volkonsky laughing. "You lost the engagement," she said. "I ended it," he said. "There's a difference. I ended it because it was the right thing to do. That it is also the thing I wanted to do is, I think, not incidental. The Earl of Whitmore will, I know what the Earl of Whitmore will do," he said. "I have a reasonably clear picture of the social and financial costs of this morning's decision. I made it anyway." "Why?" she said. She asked it simply, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a genuine question, the kind that wants only a true answer. He looked at her for a moment. "Because," he said, "there are things that cost less than they appear to, and things that cost more. The correct Latin for, I have wasted considerable time on the wrong priorities, is, I believe, tempus male consumpsi, and I would like, if you are willing, not to continue wasting it." She was quiet for a long moment. "Your Latin is improving," she said. "I have good cause to practice. The social consequences are manageable. People will talk. People always talk. You have noticed this, living in a house full of them." She looked down at the document she was still holding. The 5th clause, with Hassan's note in the margin in Turkish. She had done the work. The treaty was signed. The delegations were celebrating in the next room. She had done everything she had been brought here to do, and now she was standing in a corridor with a duke who had just dismantled his engagement because he found the alternative, which was, she understood, her, more important. This was not, she thought, a practical situation. She had spent 3 years practicing invisibility, 9 years before that being the daughter of a man who loved languages more than money, which was beautiful and impractical, and had left her here, in this corridor, holding a treaty in 2 languages that she had helped to build. She had a trunk that she had half packed and half unpacked. She had 9 languages and her father's photograph and the memory of a garden where the roses were not yet out. None of that, she thought, was an argument against this. "The roses will be out next week," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "they will." "I have never," she said, "actually seen them in bloom. I arrived after the season." "They're quite good," he said. "The ones in the North Garden particularly." "I've heard." "You're welcome," he said, with the deliberate care of someone navigating unfamiliar language, "to see them." She looked up at him. The afternoon light was generous. In the other room, someone was playing the piano again. Something cheerful this time, something that was not searching for anything because it had already found it. "That," she said, quietly, "is the best offer I have received in some time." The roses in the North Garden of Ashmore House were, as it turned out, exceptional. They were old roses, planted by Phineas's grandmother, and they had the confidence of things that have been doing what they do for a long time, and no longer feel the need to explain themselves. They came out in deep pinks and whites, and one particular variety that was almost exactly the colour of old parchment, and they smelled of something between honey and history. and they were so thoroughly and unapologetically beautiful that standing among them felt like being inside a room made entirely of good decisions. Libby was standing in that room on a Wednesday afternoon when Phineas came to find her. He had spent the 3 weeks managing the social and financial aftermath of the broken engagement with the methodical efficiency of a man who had already decided what mattered and was simply clearing the administrative debris from around it. The Earl of Whitmore had made considerable noise. As predicted, certain doors in certain drawing rooms had been briefly closed. Fellows had been heroically competent, which helped. Mrs. Partridge had run the household with the serene authority of someone who had been expecting this and had quietly prepared for it. The negotiations were concluded, successful, formally praised by all parties. Count Volkonsky had sent a personal letter, in Russian, addressed to Libby directly, which had made Fellows do an unprecedented triple take, congratulating the English on finally producing one person who could hold a proper conversation. Hassan had sent a gift, a small, beautiful edition of Persian poetry, with a note that said simply, "For the person who listened." None of this had resolved anything between Phineas and Libby, because Phineas was, still, fundamentally a man who required structure, and the structure of this particular thing needed to be built carefully. He had spent the 3 weeks building it. The framework was ready. He found her among the old roses and stood for a moment without saying anything, which was unusual for him. He was not, generally, a man who lingered in doorways. And she turned and looked at him with the clear, direct look that had been the first thing about her he had been unable to forget. "How is it?" he asked, meaning the garden. "As advertised," she said. "Better, actually. The parchment ones are my favourites." "I know. You mentioned them 3 times last week. I don't repeat myself." "You do about things you love," she said. "The Voltaire, too, and the particulars of the 1808 trade routes, and—" "I understand the point," he said, and she was smiling now, the full version of it that she no longer put away. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a letter. She looked at it. "What is this?" she asked. "But it is on," he said. "A formal offer of the position of official diplomatic translator to the Ashmore estate, at a salary that I have had reviewed and confirmed is appropriate and not insulting, with the terms outlined clearly so that there is no ambiguity." She took it. She read it. Her expression moved through several things. "This is a very formal document," she said. "I am a formal person," he said. It seemed appropriate. A pause. "There is also a second document. A second. In my other pocket." He did not retrieve it immediately. "It is less formal. It is considerably shorter. It is, in fact, for a person who is accustomed to 9 languages, somewhat embarrassingly brief." "Tell me what it says," she said. He looked at her among the roses in the afternoon light, and he said what he had spent 3 weeks finding words for, which turned out to be not many words at all. "And it says," he said, "that I am in love with you. That I have been managing this information for several weeks with varying degrees of failure. That I am aware of every reasonable argument against this position, circumstance, the opinion of the Earl of Whitmore, and that I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, that all of them together weigh less than an afternoon in a library, or a conversation in a garden about roses that were not yet out, or the fact that you are the most honest person I have ever met, and you correct my Latin, and I have never—" He paused slightly on this, the way one pauses on a truth that is new enough to still be surprising. "I have never, in 32 years, found anything so difficult to look away from." The garden was very quiet. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. The old roses did what old roses do, existed with the complete, unapologetic confidence of beautiful things that know their own worth. Libby held the letter in both hands. She thought about 9 languages, and 1 trunk, and a father who had loved ideas more than money, and had, in doing so, given her the only wealth that couldn't be taken: the habit of paying attention. She thought about 3 months of invisibility and 3 weeks of being seen. She thought about the key to the box where she kept her languages. She had not locked it, she realized, for some time. "You mispronounced tempus last week," she said. "I know. The second syllable is short. I know that too. You're going to need help." "I have been counting on it," he said. She stepped forward, out of the roses, into the afternoon. She said, "Yes, not in 9 languages, not in 8. In 1, hers, the first one, the one she had grown up speaking and reading and thinking in, the one that had carried her through all the rest. And it was, she thought, enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. Lady Cordelia Vane did not disappear quietly. That was never her style, and it would have been a betrayal of her gifts to expect otherwise. She left the signing that morning and went directly to her most reliable weapon: a drawing room full of the right people, a pot of very good tea, and a version of events in which she had ended the engagement herself, on principle, because Phineas had developed an unseemly obsession with a servant girl, and it was, frankly, beneath the dignity of the Vane name to continue. She told this story with the composure of someone who had been rehearsing it since approximately the moment she walked out of the room. And it was a good story, well constructed, and several people believed it entirely. What undid the story was Count Volkonsky. Volkonsky, who was large and sentimental and had been genuinely moved by the events of the signing, attended a supper that same evening at which Cordelia was present, holding court at one end of the table with her refined version of recent history. He listened for approximately 4 minutes before setting down his fork and informing the table, in perfectly serviceable English, which he had apparently been concealing for comic effect, that he had been present at the signing, that the Duke of Ashmore was the most sensible Englishman he had yet encountered, and that Miss Lunn was the finest diplomatic mind he had met in 30 years of international service. He said this loudly. He repeated the key points twice. He raised a glass. Cordelia's version of events did not survive the evening. She moved on, as she always would, with magnificent self-possession. But she moved on smaller than she had arrived. And London noticed, and she knew that London noticed, and that, for a woman of her particular vanity, was a sufficiently satisfying consequence. The Earl of Whitmore made considerably more noise. He wrote letters. He made calls. He withdrew the Vane family's support from 2 of Phineas's parliamentary allies, and made pointed remarks at his club about the standards of the Ashmore household. Phineas received all of this with the composure of a man who had already calculated the damage and decided it was acceptable. The Ashmore estate was old and solid, and its foundations did not shift because one earl was displeased. 2 doors in 2 drawing rooms closed. 3 others, opened by the success of the trade negotiations and the warmth of Volkonsky's public endorsement, opened wider. It was, on balance, a reasonable exchange. Fellows never fully recovered from the revelation that Miss Lunn spoke 9 languages, but he managed, and eventually became quite proud of it, in the way of people who are adjacent to extraordinary things and learn to reflect their light. Mrs. Partridge said nothing about any of it. She had known, with the certainty of someone who has spent 40 years reading rooms, how this was going to end from approximately the 3rd week of the negotiations. She had known it before Phineas knew it, before Libby permitted herself to know it. She had left the gold pin on the windowsill on the morning of the signing, not as a gesture of approval. She had never needed to approve. It had always been right. But as a small, private signal from one woman who had survived difficult things to another. You are ready. You have always been ready. Now go. On the evening of the day, Phineas proposed, formally, in the library, with a ring that had belonged to his mother and a speech that was considerably better than the one he had rehearsed. He went to find Mrs. Partridge in her sitting room. He knocked. He entered. He told her what had happened, which she already knew because she knew everything, and he said that he was grateful, which was not a word he used easily, and it cost him something to say it, and she knew that too. She arrived here with 1 trunk and 9 languages and nothing else, said Mrs. Partridge, who was looking at her window rather than at him, in the manner of someone discussing a practical matter. Her father gave her the best thing he had. You would do well to remember that. I know, said Phineas. Good, said Mrs. Partridge. Now go away. I have menus to review. He went away smiling, which she also noticed, and which also pleased her, though she did not say so. Libby said yes to the proposal. She said it in English, which was her first language and his, and the one that carried, between them, the most weight. She said it in the library, surrounded by books with penciled margins, with the ring on her finger and the fire in the grate, and 9 languages inside her like 9 different lives she had already lived. Paris and Vienna and Constantinople and St. Petersburg. All of it, every room she had ever moved through, every conversation she had listened to more carefully than anyone knew, all of it had led here, to this library, to this man who argued with books and brought her tea without deciding to, and had chosen, when it mattered, the harder and more honest thing. She had 9 languages, and now she had this. It turned out to be quite enough. If this story moved you, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments, which moment was your favourite? The library, the garden, the roses at the end. Share with someone who loves a quiet character winning loudly.